We hear the word hormones all the time, but what actually are they and how do they influence our mood, thoughts and emotional regulation?
Yeah, so we know of them, but do we actually know much about what they do? There's over 50 hormones in the body, from your heartbeat, thought processes to mood. Your hormones are involved with everything, even love. It's far more reaching than just sex hormones and periods. And that's why it's so important we understand how they work, because ultimately it affects every facet of your being.
Hannah, welcome to the Heart Healing Podcast. Thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure to be here.
So we hear the word hormones all the time, but what actually are they and how do they influence our mood, thoughts and emotional regulation?
Yeah, so we know of them, but do we actually know much about what they do? I think it's one of those things we don't get taught at school, and we should understand more about them. And they are so powerful. They are kind of the distributors of messages. So think of them like messengers. So they carry data, so they travel around the body and they deliver a message to a target cell, and that then initiates a change, and that'll be to do with a biological change, a sort of physiological change, and behavioral change.
And hormones often, I think something that I've learned on my journey is that, hormones play such a sort of a wide role in so many different bodily functions, as you allude to. We assume that it's just the sex hormones, progesterone, estrogen, and testosterone now we know more about. But actually what your book so brilliantly highlights is that there are so many more.
So many. There's over 50 hormones in the body, but I tend to talk about the VIPs, but within that we have the sex hormones, as you mentioned, your stress hormone, cortisol, we have your thyroid hormones, your love and bonding hormones, and actually from your heartbeat to thought processes to mood, obviously reproductive system, neurological systems, your hormones are involved with everything, even love, because oxytocin is one of the biggest contributors to feelings of love and bonding. So it's far more reaching than just sex hormones and periods. And that's why it's so important we understand how they work, how we can make them function more optimally, because ultimately it affects every facet of your being.
Absolutely. And what is the difference between a hormone and a neurotransmitter? Because this is something that I get quite confused by, because we hear about oxytocin, serotonin, endorphins, dopamine often. What is the difference?
So ultimately they're still messengers, but think of neurotransmitters as they're the quick fire response, and they act locally. So they're more to do with quicker messages with sort of nerves, also muscles and the brain. And if we think of like a rapid response unit, they act in milliseconds. Hormones, they sort of take a little bit more time. It's, more like minutes, sometimes hours. So again, they're messengers, but they travel around the whole body. So they are ultimately much the same. They deliver messengers, but hormones travel around the body. They're can have far more reaching impacts with things like mood, energy, metabolic function, and neurotransmitters are like sort of quick fire responses that happen locally. But some hormones wear different hats. So serotonin we class as a hormone, but also a neurotransmitter. It's never quite simple. We get a bit of dual action with things like hormones, and they do wear little different hats now and again. But think of it more to do with speed. Neurotransmitters, quick fire, and hormones can be a bit slower and steadier with their messaging.
Okay, that's very helpful to remember. And yeah, as you said, so serotonin and oxytocin kind of cross that neurotransmitter hormone.
Yeah, and also vitamin D is also a vitamin, but also a hormone. We like to be, the thing is with biology and particularly nutrition, it isn't binary. There's a lot of intricate sort of dances and things wearing different hats, things changing. Testosterone is actually a precursor to estrogen, which a lot of people don't understand. And so people change, and hormones change, hormones change, and it's not just we wear one hat. So there are instances where we define things as neurotransmitters, but then also hormones.
What would you say affects our mental health more, neurotransmitters or hormones?
Well, it's the neurotransmitters so serotonin, dopamine, we have GABA, which is really involved with particularly progesterone. but it's the hormones themselves and then their influence on neurotransmitters that tend to influence the mood, because hormones don't necessarily directly impact mood, but it's to do with how they then impact the neurotransmitters. So there's this far-reaching effect when you have, say, too much estrogen, not enough estrogen, too much testosterone, not enough, or not enough of this and that. It's these imbalances that can then influence the sort of composition of neurotransmitters you have, and then that can obviously influence mental health. However, estrogen is heavily involved with the protection of the brain and the plasticity of it. And so there we do have a bit more of an influence. But I think defining them in little camps, so that has more of an impact than that. They all work together, and we've got to sort of think of it as one massive party, and actually the environment that they create. And it's hormones that can kind of open the door to there being a window of vulnerability for mental health, anxiety, depression. So it's a bit of a complex answer, and not, but it's sort of, yes, the neurotransmitters have more of a direct impact, I say, on your mood and how you're feeling, but hormones overall will impact them, and then other wide-reaching sort of factors of mental health.
Right. If you could identify one hormone that's most responsible for our mental health, which one would that be?
I mean, I suppose that's hard to say, because we have obviously the classic cortisol that we tend to blame for everything, particularly on TikTok at the moment. But cortisol is an amazing hormone, super motivating. But when that is elevated, that obviously can drive anxiety, low mood, feeling stressed, stuck in that fight or flight response. So cortisol has a big role to play. But I'd say estrogen and progesterone as a duo act have a huge role to play, particularly in female health and female mental health. It's when those hormones drop or shift, we see the biggest vulnerability. So puberty, postnatally, perimenopause, these are the big windows where the drop of these hormones can suddenly feel the impact, particularly progesterone, because that, again, I mentioned the neurotransmitter GABA, super calming. When we see issues of that dropping before a period, or when we're in that postnatal phase, or in perimenopause, again, those are the biggest windows of vulnerability. So I'd say that sort of the menstrual duo tag team, estrogen, progesterone, but then cortisol plays a big role too. But it's never just one thing. It's always a number of things coming together.
Let's talk collagen for a sec. If you've tried it before and thought, is this actually doing anything? I get it. I too have been there. Collagen's become a bit of a buzzword today, but it really is important. It's the main structural protein that supports our skin, joints, muscles, and connective tissue. And from our mid-20s, we start producing a little less each year, which is why we notice these subtle changes that we can't quite explain. What I like about Ingenious Collagen is that it does things differently. It's not powders or drinks. It's patented capsules designed to protect the collagen until it reaches the small intestine, where absorption really happens. Instead of mega dosing, it's about smart delivery and consistency. For me, it's become part of my daily routine, supporting my skin, hair, nails, and how my body feels day to day. If you're collagen curious, or you've tried it before and felt maybe a little underwhelmed, then this one I really would genuinely recommend. You can get 20% off your first purchase or your first subscription with code HEALING20. That's HEALING20 for 20% off. So I'd love to discuss now each of the main hormones, particularly and their effect on our emotions. So estrogen, I think, is often described as being the protective hormone. And what role does it play in influencing anxiety, low mood, brain fog, and even low confidence, I think, at times? Yeah,
so with estrogen, we think of it as the sort of main female hormone, which is very much in charge of the menstrual cycle. It is that, but I actually describe it more of a life hormone. It's involved with so many things. Protective is a word I'd really sort of stick alongside that. And so when we see issues with estrogen, whether it's low levels or actually too much of it, it can have a sort of a massive impact on our mood, but also the structure of the brain. And so we know that throughout the cycle, the structure of the brain changes. And then also in menopause, it sort of changes. And that can really impact your brain sort of resilience. And that can have an impact, of course, on mental health. But I think with estrogen, when we think about mental health and we think about sort of the impact it can have, it's often how does that manifest from a symptom point of view? And so if it's impacting your body shape, if you're not regularly having a cycle, all these things that can actually make you question whether you're womanly enough. So in the case of something like polycystic ovarian syndrome, which I have personal experience with, but work with it a lot in clinic, it can just feel, really full on in terms of the quality of life you can have when it's really low on the floor. If you're not regularly sort of ovulating, if you're not having a period, if there's troubles with fertility, that can then give you a sense of, questioning your self-worth as a woman. It's very complex, but these are issues that I know I experienced. So many women in my clinic talk about. So it's actually, is it the hormone themselves, or is it actually the picture that comes with it when there's too much or too little, if that makes sense? But directly, estrogen, as I said, very protective when it comes to the brain. And if we're not then ovulating properly, we then aren't producing adequate levels of progesterone. So progesterone is a really lovely hormone. We call it the calming hormone. And that gets produced when we ovulate predominantly. And if it's sort of, we follow what happens in that sort of upstream nature, if we don't have enough estrogen or adequate levels to ovulate, we then don't produce enough levels of progesterone. And there are progesterone receptors in the brain. And if we have low levels of that, we have low levels of a metabolite, which is called allopregnanolone, which is like a spin-off. So think of like the show Frasier and Cheers, we have a little spin-off. It's the spin-off of progesterone. And that has one of the biggest influences on GABA. So that real calming neurotransmitter. So when progesterone is really low, or it's low in comparison to estrogen, it can be one of the biggest driving forces of low mood, anxiety, that feeling of PMS, and that window vulnerability in perimenopause and beyond, because all of a sudden that hormone has sort of disappeared and its metabolites, and your body has a bit of a hard time coping with that. So yeah, again, it creates that environment where the window is open to feeling more anxious and low and all those things.
So you talk a lot about the levels of progesterone and estrogen being too low. Can they ever be too high?
Of course, with estrogen, absolutely, that can be too high. And interestingly, because you might think, well, let's just have loads of estrogen, loads of progesterone. But everything needs to work in this lovely ideal. And obviously, these hormones shift throughout the month. But if we have too much estrogen, which we sometimes talk about as a dominance of estrogen. We have something called the theory of estrogen dominance, which is when we have too much of it, that can be a real driving force too. So when it comes to your hormones, once they've done their job, we need to clear them out and they need to exit. They do this through the liver and the gut. And if we aren't clearing hormones correctly, we can get kind of a bit of a backlog and excess of free hormones in the body. And that in particular, let's say, for example, with estrogen, painful breasts, PMS, difficulty losing weight around the middle, and migraines, irritability, you can have too much of a good thing. So it's about getting those levels right. Otherwise, it would be, woohoo, let's just get more estrogen in there. And the thing is, with things like HRT, which can be very useful, that's when levels are really, really on the floor. But we don't want to just throw more into the mix, because you can definitely have too much of a good thing. And that's with testosterone, that's with estrogen. And we tend not to see very high levels of progesterone in a system, it's not very often you see that. But then if you have too much of that, that could be shorter cycles, and that can sort of manifest as that.
So testosterone, I mean, it's becoming increasingly discussed in women now. I think in the last probably year or two, it's suddenly become in vogue to talk about our levels of testosterone. And a lot of women, particularly in the menopausal sort of years, are supplementing it. So how does it affect motivation, resilience and libido and just our overall psychological well-being?
Yeah, kind of all of those things. It's a real, so if you think of them as little characters, we have estrogen, which is sort of this life protective hormone. Progesterone's very calming. Testosterone's a pretty strong, burly hormone. And actually, it's the most abundant sex hormone in the female body. It is a precursor to estrogen, as I mentioned before. So testosterone is, its role is very much growth. So muscle growth, regeneration, has actually now a role to play with the sort of the shedding of the lining, and sort of as every month we sort of shed and then rebuild a lining. We know that actually testosterone's got a role to play in that. But it's that, you know, libido, motivation. It's really important from that perspective for women. However, if we have too sort of low levels, that can obviously impact libido and it being low. But if we have too much, that's that particular profile of what we call polycystic ovarian syndrome. Then we can see it's, you know, a male sexual characteristic hormone. Both men and women have it, but if we have too much of it in a female body, we can see things like acne, we can see things like excess hair, particularly on the face, on the nipples, in some cases on the chest, and then we can also see male patterned baldness, so particularly here. So again, we want those levels just right, but it has a really big role to play with, you know, muscle growth and strength and bone health, as does estrogen. So they all play their role, and it's not like there's just one in charge of one thing. They sort of all work together, as I say, in this intricate dance. But what we are finding now is with the landscape of HRT, as more women are becoming informed, and you know, there was sort of a really great movement a couple of years ago with some documentaries and people talking about it more, actually looking at not only supplementing with, say, estrogen and progesterone, but actually looking at testosterone levels too, because of sex drive being on the floor. So it has a big role to play there. But if there is, you know, sort of with testosterone, it's part of a wider family. So we call that the androgens. So that's like the collective term for the male sexual characteristic hormones. So we have testosterone within that, another hormone called DHT, DHEA, DHES, and it's DHT which can be a real driving force behind acne in women. And that's something that, it's a hormone that actually doesn't have a role in the female body, but if there's too much of it, that can really manifest as those things. So again, it's getting those levels right. And to do that, it's about creating an environment where they can do their job most optimally. Because we tend to blame our hormones, but it's not them, it's the environment that they're living in.
So what is that optimal environment for hormones to thrive in?
So it's a number of things. It is, well, genetics plays a major role. We all have a genetic blueprint. I have the genetic blueprint for PCOS and endometriosis. That's just the hand I got dealt. But it's how you then sort of create an environment which works to try and dial down the things that could drive your hormones to misbehave. So there's always something going on, and you've got to go upstream. So whether that is your blood sugar regulation, whether it is nutrient deficiencies, sleep, gut composition, your circadian rhythm, your nervous system, positivity, creative outlets, stress, spinning the plates, you know, it's never just one thing. But as a nutrition plays a major role in all of this, but it's never just one thing. We have to look at all the pillars that come together. And so you always have to look at the individual, because everyone's going to be different. Everyone's going to have different drivers. But first and foremost, we sort of start at the very beginning, and we tend to look at what are the biggest drivers for hormonal issues in the system. And there's something I call the triple threat. We have insulin resistance, inflammation, and stress. These are the three main guys that we want to really be focusing on as a first port of call. And then obviously we have nutrient deficiencies, the sort of composition of the gut, stress, in a bit more detail, but we always start there. So blood sugar regulation is one of, for women, the key places to start, because it has a direct impact on actually how your sex hormones get around the body, how much testosterone we produce. And so if that's not working adequately, all of a sudden your transportation system for your hormones can become defunct, because your sex hormones are fat-based. So testosterone, progesterone, estrogen, they're all made from a lipid, cholesterol. And your blood is water-based. So for them to get around the body, they have to hop onto a transportation system, and it's a protein called sex hormone binding globulin. That sounds fancy, but just think of it like your sexy bus, I call them. So your sex hormone bus, it's produced in the liver, and so they sort of hop on this bus, go from A to B. And if we have an issue with blood sugar regulation and we have something called insulin resistance, which is when we start to build up a tolerance to insulin, which regulates our blood sugar levels, those buses can start to deplete. So if you think of Oxford Street on a Saturday and all the buses going every minute, if all of a sudden there's one bus, you're going to have this massive backlog of hormones being like, where's the bus? And so actually what happens is these hormones just sort of enter into the system and they don't go to where they should go. This creates a bit of mayhem, and then we can see us putting more hormones back into the system, and it just becomes a bit of a mess. So it's one of the most important places to start. It's the biggest driver for conditions like PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome, and it's a mechanism that becomes so much more at risk for women as we age. So in perimenopause and menopause, it's one of the things that we just become more at risk of having, insulin resistance. So we just get worse and worse at dealing with glucose as we get older. So it's the first place we start. And then we sort of open up the conversation to all the other things. So, you know, the world of nutrition, specific things, and it's all individual. Everyone's going to be so different, and it depends what's manifesting. Is it too, an estrogen dominance? Is it too much testosterone, or is it not enough? And so it all depends on what that individual picture looks like.
And I think something I've learned on my journey, having had, a long history of an eating disorder, is that all these elimination diets actually really act against our hormones in a big way. I mean, for a long time, I avoided carbs because carbs
same.
are kind of
Didn't eat
demonized.
carbs for years.
And it wreaks havoc on your hormones, right?
Yeah. I look back to my 20s, and there's this book called Skinny Bitch that just came out. I think we all did it. And, you name it, I did it. So as a profile with PCOS, it's not for everyone, but for the majority of people, because of that high insulin, high cortisol picture, it can be very hard to lose weight. And so for so many women, they just get told, just lose weight. But losing weight or going into a calorie deficit does not solve a metabolic issue. In fact, it can really make it worse. And so I made it completely, I did every diet under the sun, juicing, Dukan, didn't touch a carb, as I said, went vegan for a while. And it just made everything worse and worse. And the thing is, for the body, we have to remember that your body's best asset to survive is energy. And so when that body is stressed, it will do its best to hold on to energy. And if you start stressing the body out by removing food and fasting, I used to do 2-hour runs without eating anything and not eat until after 2 p.m. Your body's like, hang on a minute, where's the energy? And that is a stressor. Not all stress is bad. Exercise is a form of stress, and not all fasting is necessarily bad. It's how you do it. But when your body is reading this data, everything that you do, your behavior, what you eat, it's data for the body. And if you're giving it data of taking away things like food and carbohydrates and energy sources, your body goes, hang on a minute, is famine around the corner? Do I need to get into survival mode? And then we can see this upregulation of cortisol, and it plays havoc, because if we think of your hormones, obviously they all work together in an intricate dance, but at the top of the hormone hierarchy, cortisol sits at the very top, because that is your it's more than just a survival hormone. It's an amazing hormone, but it will kind of override everything. It's like a foghorn. And so if we do things like, we undereat, that's a huge stress. And then your body might read that as a stress signal and think, actually, now's not the right time to be, reproducing and working on digesting that sandwich. And so we see reproduction and sort of digestion systems compromised because your body doesn't quite need that to survival, and it prioritizes other things. And it can be really cyclical, particularly with conditions like PCOS. And we know from the data that if you have conditions like that, you are far more likely to have an eating disorder and you're far more likely to commit suicide. And it's frightening, but we have this sort of situational loop where we can create this perfect storm for things like eating disorders, and it sort of feeds into things. But yeah, it was a toxic time growing up when I was growing up with all the diet stuff, but it still is. It just comes in different forms, but it's unfortunately, the thing is with your hormones, they need the raw materials to do their job. They need the nutrients. We need the fiber to feed the gut, which has, serotonin is predominantly made in the gut. And so if we're compromising our nutrient intake and we're stressing the body out by sort of restricting, that has far-reaching impacts.
So a lot of people are now talking about cortisol because I think Dr. Stacey Sims has made this use of huge movement towards women shouldn't train fasted. Women should really be kind of monitoring that, like you said, that they're eating enough. Because so many women sort of like, oh, I don't understand, I'm putting on weight and I'm eating less than I've ever eaten before. But that is presumably because they're in this elevated cortisol response.
Sure, it's it's a myriad of different things, but ultimately, the body isn't designed to lose weight. It's designed to survive, and it's so complex and clever, and it will outsmart restriction. And what we can see, and it's not automatic, it doesn't happen with every woman. Some women who are highly stressed lose weight, but what we know is that when there is higher or dysregulated cortisol, so it's not forming that sort of diurnal daily pattern that we want, your body will prioritize storing fat. It will prioritize the foods you crave and sort of influence your cravings. So you'll sort of end up craving more high ticket items, high sugar, high fat. And your body will prioritize storing fat, particularly around the middle. It will also start to hinder mechanisms in the body to keep that best asset, energy. So it won't make you so good at dealing with glucose, so you store more of it. And it's very clever. It's sort of always on the hunt to ensure you have that little bit of extra energy. So if you then think, oh, right, I need to lose weight, I need to just keep on cutting what I'm eating, working out harder and harder, that is a stress signal, and that comes across as a threat to the body. And your body's like, I'm not going to let go of that fat. And it really holds on to it. Cortisol does this indirectly, so it tells your body to obviously crave more things. It can lower your basal metabolic rate, but directly it can actually make your fat cells bigger and blow them up like a balloon. And we can see things like cortisol belly, which is not really a medical term, but it's that idea of we tend to hold more fat around the abdomen. Cortisol face. Now, the thing is with cortisol face, if we have a serious condition called Cushing's, you can get something called moon face, where we see that rounded face. But the idea of cortisol face, it's more of a sort of indirect relationship with inflammation, water retention in the face. But the idea of the cortisol face, because that's a lot doing the rounds on the internet, but it's not just cortisol doing that thing. It's loads of different things coming together for that. But absolutely, that notion of like work out harder, eat less, and then your body learns just to work on less and less and less, and then you eat normally, and then your body's like, hurrah, we have some energy, and then we hold on to it more. So it is so frustrating, and it feels like you're hitting your head against a brick wall. And when we have conditions like PCOS, or we have hypothyroidism, just cutting calories or eating less or cutting out carbs is like one of the worst things you can do. You actually have to work on creating an environment where your body feels safe enough to not hold on to energy and have a metabolism that's working really, really well. But yeah, I was definitely there in the noughties doing all the wrong things, obviously before I went and studied nutrition. But, it's still really rife for women because unfortunately people in some cases get really bad advice.
What does happen in the brain when cortisol is just perpetually elevated and chronically elevated?
Yeah, so as opposed to sort of the brain, we think of the wider stress response. So you have the HPA axis, your hypothalamus, your pituitary, and your adrenals. So in the brain, your sort of the amygdala, we will sense a threat. And we have, first off, the automatic nervous system, which is really quick. So that's your fight or flight mode will be initiated, which gets the heart rate going. Basically, you're ready to fight a bear. It's that feeling of fight, flight, freeze, fawn is actually the full terminology. And then because that's sort of, we have sort of neurotransmitters involved, when we sort of have the HP axis on the other way, it's slightly slower. And then the hypothalamus tells the pituitary, and then the adrenals, which are glands that sit above the kidneys, to produce cortisol. So the idea is we sense a threat, and then we produce cortisol, get ready to fight or flight. We deal with that. It goes, and then like an elastic band, we ping back to baseline. So we wouldn't have elevated cortisol, and we wouldn't be in fight or flight, we'd be in rest and digest. The thing is, for so many of us, we are getting threats right, left and centre, whether that's work deadlines, the millennial spin of like trying to be it all, be a mum, be a career woman, not setting boundaries, fasting, not regulating your blood sugar. All of this data is a threat, and we haven't evolved to know the difference between a toxic friendship and a bear chasing you down the street. So we have this constant deluge of different threats, and your body starts to find it hard to ping back to baseline. So we have a daily pattern of cortisol. We have something called the cortisol awakening response. So that wakes you up in the morning, and then it tails off in the evening, and then melatonin takes over. That's your daily pattern. But then on top of that, we have like this alarm system where cortisol gets called to the party to deal with something stressful. But the thing is, when that's happening all the time, we're not going back to baseline. So what can happen is we just have this bit like a bar of soap. It's just completely in suds. And we have this ongoing cortisol where we are just stuck in that fight or flight, and we're not pulling back down again. And it's sort of your stress response. That's the wider picture, we call it. Your brain's involved, but it's this wider thing. And that will then send this message across the system, which can impact your other hormones and influence it. So what happens is, it's really hard just to get through the day. We wake up groggy. We stop that natural pattern of cortisol starts being impacted. And actually, we talk about high cortisol, but what can happen is we can have blunted cortisol, which is actually when we start flatlining. And so we don't get that surge in the morning that wakes us up. So you're like, oh my God, I literally cannot get out of bed, snooze. Your motivation is low because cortisol is really motivating, and you are on high alert. Things make you jump. Things, when I was dealing with, I was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress after the birth of my first child. And I was in such heightened sort of fight or flight. I would walk into a room, and if I saw my hair straighteners, the wire, I'd think it was a snake. So you're in this hypervigilant state. And what happens is we see high functioning anxiety, we see a compromised gut, we see issues with bloating, low mood, irregular periods. So, everything influences everything. There's no the stress hormone and the sex hormones. It's like we are one. And so it can just be so far reaching. And so many women are struggling because we are in roles of friends, partners, lovers, caregivers, mothers, sisters. And sometimes it can be really hard to say no and put your foot down and set boundaries and fit in that run, and then start working on nutrition. Oh, but I've got to do that email. And I think women are really struggling. We know that burnout is on the rise, particularly with women, and it's more prevalent with women in the workplace. And then we have women from my generation, the sort of millennials who broke these boundaries with careers and having these careers, but we're still shouldering all the domestic childcare. So it's a bit of a hard time, you know, for us and for cortisol to do its job properly, because cortisol is an amazing hormone. You want it around in a stressful situation. It might just save your life, and it's incredible. But it's when there's just too much of it, or the pattern gets dysregulated, you know, you might just, it goes topsy-turvy where you can't get out of bed, but then you can't get to sleep. It's that classic tired but wired feeling. And it's not nice.
And is it mainly lifestyle factors which would help one redress the balance of cortisol in your body?
It is an absolute combination. Diet plays such a big role, and I think a lot of people don't understand. When it comes to your nervous system, it's not about just how you treat it, it's how you feed it too. Because everything, as I mentioned before, is data for your body. And if we are fasting, or if we have dysregulated blood sugar, or if we are eating foods that are very inflammatory, ultra-processed foods, this can drive up cortisol. So it's that alongside the lifestyle stuff too. I just need a water.
Go for it.
To pour, sorry.
Don't, you are. Take as much time as you need.
Yeah.
I always say so when you get problem with it.
When you start chatting too much.
And you know that
Sorry.
you know it's coming, and then you're like, all good.
Yeah.
You've mentioned hypothyroidism, and there's also obviously hyperthyroidism, which affects more of a minority of people.
Yeah.
And I've actually experienced low thyroid function myself, and I think a lot of women who have got eating disorders do, and a lot of women who don't eat enough do, because we don't realize the implications that starvation has on down-regulating our ability to produce, you know, TH3 and thyroid regulating hormone, etc. So how does the thyroid influence anxiety and mood disorders and just generally our body?
So interestingly, when we think of, hypo is that sort of low functioning sluggish thyroid, and T3 and T4, so your thyroid hormones, they are ultimately made of iodine, and we need iron and iodine, both of these nutrients. And if we are really compromising our nutrient intake, if we're not eating, we can see inadequate levels of iodine. And actually it's 80% of hypothyroidism is driven by low iodine intake. So the diet plays a huge role with how the thyroid functions. And if we are not sort of, you know, so when we think of the thyroid, it's sort of heartbeat, temperature, regulation, and it has a really far-reaching impact on mood as well. So we can see very much low mood play a part in that hypothyroid sort of picture. You can get very cold hands, you can not be able to regulate your temperature at all, it can really impact your heartbeat. And then we know that thyroid hormones have a major role to play with your reproductive system too. So again, that plays a big role in the environment, which can then influence how you feel. And then if your energy is on the floor, if you're feeling sluggish, that can then bring on low mood. So again, is it neurological, or is it actually the symptoms that come with it? It's a little bit of both. So it's in that picture we can just see someone who's just, their very being is compromised, and you're exhausted and you're tired, and that's going to really make you feel low and impact mood.
Yeah, and it's a funny one because it's quite controversial, the thyroid, because a lot of doctors want to whack you on pretty high doses of these things like levothyroxine if you've got low thyroid function. But I can't help but feel that actually if it is induced by your lifestyle and your diet, then actually one can really do a lot to remedy it by changing that.
Yeah, huge. You can do a huge amount. And so, as I say, iodine, it's one of those things that it's quite hard to get in the diet. Seaweed, it's really high in. So much so in places like America, they've even iodinized salt to help with the issues with... and
I think Celtic salt, isn't that here? Has that got added iodine in it?
So there is, so when you have more of like the sea salt, there can be iodine in there. So when we think of iodine, think of the seaweed, but with sort of table salt, they're actually fortifying it and adding more iodine in to try and combat this sort of epidemic of hypothyroidism. And so there has been a shift. But, iron plays a major role alongside many other things. And so there's a huge amount we can do with diet and lifestyle before we even start treading towards actual medication. We then also have autoimmune conditions. So, and we never want to poo-poo medication because it can be incredible when needed. But sometimes there are lots of avenues you can sort of test out first before you go down that route. But if anyone is listening who is on actual thyroid medication, you have to be very careful with iodine. So don't start bringing that into the equation because we can sort of contraindicate and impact the thyroid. So you've got to tread carefully. If you are on thyroid medication, working with a professional, because if you start supplementing or taking, loads of seaweed, that could be detrimental. So we've got to be careful there.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. And how does hypothyroidism tend to affect our mood?
Hypo?
Yeah.
So low mood.
Yeah, low mood. And hyper?
Hyper is when we see it's the other end of the spectrum where it's sort of running super fast, and we can see things like weight loss. Again, it's going to impact mood in a similar way where we can see, low mood come with it. You tend to be a little bit more anxious, and there can be anxiety as part of that. But again, it's all very individual to the person.
When someone says that they feel hormonally off, what are the most common mental health symptoms that you see? I
think in my own clinic, not feeling like themselves is a huge thing I hear. I just want to feel like myself again. I just don't feel like me. I think not recognizing yourself is a big thing. Low energy and, losing that get up and go and motivation, and anxiety and worry, rumination, the mind playing tricks on you, not being able to fall asleep. I think those tend to be the top ones that I hear a lot in clinic. And I've probably experienced myself, if I'm honest.
Do you think that there's a correlation between hormonal imbalance and chronic pain? It's something that I'm really interested in.
Hormonal imbalance and chronic pain?
Yeah.
Well, one can definitely exist with the other. So you think of things like endometriosis, which I had recent surgery for in December, and it was the first flare-up I'd had in 10 years. And, estrogen plays a major role in that. It is very much an estrogen-dependent condition, but it's the inflammation where we see that pain. And the thing is, where there is pain, there is inflammation. Where there's inflammation, there's hormonal imbalance. So we see a really sort of bi-directional relationship there, 100%.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Will you tell us about your own experience then with PCOS and how it affected you and your journey through it?
I kind of got the double whammy, PCOS and endometriosis. So if I go back to when I was a teenager, my period was never regular, but it's still coming into its own a little bit. But like most kids in the 90s, it was just a given we were put on the pill. Everyone kind of went on the pill when we were 15. And it was when I came off the pill, my period never returned for 2 years. And I was just told, it's normal. It's just your body readjusting. And that is not normal. And I was suffering with actual, it would have been anxiety, but that wasn't really a word back when I was growing up. I just thought, this is not right. And then eventually my weight would absolutely fluctuate. And for me to keep my weight down, I would have to do these bonkers diets all the time, yo-yoing all the time. And it was a real era for all of that, a diet based on just one cereal twice a day, and did that a number of times, which is just wild. So many of them. And I just felt there was something wrong. And so I then was able to go private and then get a diagnosis of polycystic ovarian syndrome. So that's, high androgens, irregular periods. I didn't have a period for 2 years. And it was an internal scan and hormonal blood test that then gave me the diagnosis. But then I was just told, just lose weight, come back if you want to have children, and that was it. So I wasn't given any advice whatsoever. I had no idea that diet and lifestyle could really play a role, but I'd always been really interested in nutrition. And, the advice was, sadly, 20 years later, the same young girls are coming into my clinic are being told the same thing. And it's just a shame that, you know, these girls are being told the same thing. Just lose weight, come back if you want to have children. Because my symptoms obviously weren't worthy enough of having support unless I wanted children. I mean, it's bonkers. And then throw into the mix, I was living in New York, working in theatre. It wasn't really my priority. But then my symptoms started to get worse. And then I actually started to notice pain in my mid-20s, went back to doctors, kept on getting brushed off, told it was trap wind. I, at this point, had really started to look more into nutrition and lifestyle and actually decided to pivot my career, go back and study for 3 years to qualify as a nutritionist. And it was only when I was doing that I came across endometriosis. And I went back to the GP being like, I think this could be it. And they said, you do not have it. You could not have it. One GP had to look it up, didn't even know what it was. I was told, you know, there's nothing wrong with me. And I had such severe, the pain was outrageous. You know, bowel movements, I couldn't even have them. I felt like I was being stabbed. It felt like there was metal scraping up and down my legs, pain during sex. The fatigue was wild. And because we likely think it's autoimmune, you know, your immune system is fighting this, so your body is so exhausted and tired. And then you start thinking it's in your head. And then you start thinking you're going mad, because if you can't see it, you know, how do you prove and validate that you're going through this pain? And you start actually and you start to drive yourself mad, thinking, I'm imagining it. What's wrong with me? And then I was like, this can't be right. So I didn't take no for an answer. And I was lucky enough to go and see a private doctor. And he was just like, well, of course, this sounds like endometriosis. And then I had my first surgery and it was stage 4. And it was rife around, you know, each fallopian tube, behind the uterus, in a place called the pouch of Douglas, which is sort of in between, sort of behind the uterus and sort of the bum and, you know, close to the bowels. You know, endometriosis isn't just about the uterus. It can even be present in lungs. It's sort of far reaching. And luckily I had surgery, and then I knew what to do from a diet perspective. So it's very much clearing estrogen. So with this sort of double whammy, of very low progesterone, a dominance of estrogen, and this sort of mega mix of issues, I just got to work on diet and lifestyle. And just that was my big focal point when I was studying women's health. And then I managed to then go on and conceive and have 2 children naturally, which is something I never thought would be possible. And then work with women, you know, for the last decade, helping them achieve, you know, their goals too. But I would say it wouldn't have been possible without surgery. And so it's so important you bring in all the elements. It takes a village. And so my incredible doctor, Dr. Colin Davis, who operated on me back in December, because I had my first flare up in 10 years, you know, it's very much about integrative medicine. Seek the help from all parties, nutrition, lifestyle, but don't poo-poo medication, because it's incredible. And I wouldn't be here, hopefully I would have been here in terms of, like, you know, being a mother and all those things without the surgery, because it was removing the endometriosis. And then you kind of have a bit of a level playing field. And if you do have a flare up, it's not a failure. I mean, I had my first last year in December, but I know what I'm doing and I'm an expert, and I still had one. It kind of has a bit of a life of its own sometimes. But if we think of mental health, I know when I was the most stressed, the volume button was the highest on my symptoms. So that mid-20s, what am I doing with my life, trying to make it in theatre, make it in Broadway, things like, you know, not knowing what to be doing with my life, really stressed, going out too much. And then if I think about, you know, last year, you know, writing a book, being a mum, running a business, spinning the plates, like there's a lot of moments where mental health played a big role. I know I had seriously high functioning anxiety in my 20s, like a panic attack that I called an ambulance because I thought I was dying. And then the post-traumatic stress was not a hormonal issue, that was just from a traumatic birth, but that played a big role in really sort of the getting back to a good place after birth, hormonally. Luckily, I knew what I was doing. But it's these windows of vulnerability when there's a shift. If there's a shift, there's a window of vulnerability. And so that's what we've got to be, you know, really aware of as women. If you're going through a shift postnatally, perimenopause, you've got to walk on eggshells a little bit with your mental health and just really nourish it and look after it.
And what were the main diet and lifestyle factors and changes that you made that really significantly impacted your PCOS and your ability to manage it?
It sounds boring, but eating at regular windows, not fasting. So waking up, and as I say, everything is data to your body. So you need to remind your body what time zone it's in. You need to remind it it's the morning, and you need to remind your nervous system that it's safe. And really easy ways to do this, we call it circadian entrainment. It's like you entrain your circadian rhythm. You're telling it, you're the storyteller. So you wake up, you don't snooze, you get out of bed, open the blinds, daylight as soon as possible, and you eat within 60 minutes of eating. 60 to 90, I say 60.
Of waking,
yeah. So it's, you know, not going, oh, I'll just sort the kiddies out, or I'll just go, oh, get the tube, I'll grab something on the way, and then all of a sudden it's like 11 a.m. and you haven't eaten. So eating, moving coffee after breakfast, not going harder, faster, stronger with like cycle and spin and all those things. Although I love that. Doing those now and again is amazing, but doing, you know, long runs. So I never run longer than 10K. That sounds like a long way, but I used to do like a lot longer. And so I tend to only run between 5 and 7K and just really enjoy it. I do a lot of rebounding. I do a lot of bouncing around, dancing. And then from a nutritional point of view, it's very much keeping that blood sugar balance, not being afraid of carbohydrates, not being afraid of fat. My goodness, fat was the enemy in, you know, growing up, and not being afraid of that. And actually, food is the most amazing thing. And I've always been a foodie, and it's just about understanding it is such a powerful modulator. I think setting boundaries, positivity, creativity. I think I'm a very creative person, and in my early 20s, and for most of my 20s was working in sort of the creative arts. And then when that stopped, I didn't have a creative outlet. And so that's also a point where my symptoms got worse, interestingly. So I think it's about trying the best you can just to stick with the classics, breakfast, lunch and dinner, eating a varied diet, looking after the gut, looking after the liver and clearing estrogen for me, but also not trying to be perfect, because there is no such thing as a perfect diet. If it's positive to maintain, if it's positive to attain, it will be positive to maintain. And I think with that yo-yoing culture and that on it, off it, good, bad, you kind of forget the fact that you just are. And just do the best you can for the majority of the time. And this is something I work with my clients on so much. Like, it's not about, putting this stuff on a pedestal. It's just doing the best you can, because you're not in competition with anyone. And actually your body wants to work optimally. Your hormones want to do their jobs optimally, but they can find it really hard. We have, a massive increase in endocrine disorders. Girls are reaching puberty younger. There's more severity sort of in terms of menopausal symptoms being reported. Our DNA hasn't mutated, or our hormones. Everything around us has. The food we eat, the culture of being online the whole time, being on your phone, technology, products, pesticides, endocrine disrupting hormones. Like, it's a really hard place for our hormones to live in, let alone us. And so you just got to do your best you can to sort of really be aware of kind of just doing all the things to protect the condition of your body, because any condition is a reflection of the condition of the body in a lot of cases, with a genetic profile underneath.
So would you say that the rise in things like PCOS and endometriosis aren't really to do with an efficiency of diagnosis? They're actually more to do with lifestyle factors and diet changing?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think the answer is nuanced and complex. But I don't think that, obviously we are more aware. People are being, it's the expansion of awareness and more people are being diagnosed. But we are seeing an increase in the condition, which would indicate that it's more prevalent. And the thing is with PCOS, it can kind of become dormant. You cannot cure PCOS in the same way you can't cure endometriosis, but you can turn the volume button down. And if more people are eating ultra-processed foods, they're highly stressed, they're not regularly exercising, the volume button goes up. So they end up going to the doctor. So whether it's more prevalent actually from a genetics point of view, or maybe the volume button's being turned up more, I think it's the volume button. It's a really hard place for PCOS to live. And it's no one's fault if you end up having a sort of a moment when those symptoms really manifest. But in the same way, because positive eating and living and doing all the lovely things, if that can turn the volume button down, that's a really positive thing. The world is turning it up, I think, if that makes sense.
Yeah, completely.
Yeah.
We've touched on the menopause and perimenopause, but what is actually going on in those years to your hormones?
So what happens is it's the slow decline of estrogen, progesterone and testosterone dialing down. And that then has a wider influence on serotonin and how much we can make, the stress response. So if we think about that elastic band and your stress response and how well it can ping back to baseline, it doesn't do that so well. So we can actually be less resilient to stress, so we can feel it a little bit more. You are then also way more susceptible to that sort of insulin resistance. So it's as those hormones dial down, the body just doesn't work so well, unfortunately. And estrogen is such a protective hormone. The fact we have such abundant levels as women is what we kind of equate to women living longer than men. And it's so protective. So when those levels come down, we're more susceptible for things going wrong. So we have to work a little bit harder at supporting the systems that don't work so well. And so we have to really support glucose. We have to really support the nervous system. We have to really support the gut. We have something called the estrobolome, which is a constellation of bacteria in the gut that really help with estrogen metabolism breakdown. And so we just have to work that little bit harder. And the things that you would do in your 30s, we just have to continue doing those. So if I was working with a client now in their 30s, the stuff that I'll be teaching them to do is the stuff that they would be doing even more so in their 40s, in their 50s, 60s, 70s, and so on. It doesn't change dramatically. We just got to kind of get better at doing it because the risk factors just go up on all these things. And then the plasticity of the brain, as I mentioned. So as estrogen drops, so does the brain's structure. And so that's why we can be way more susceptible for mental health issues. It's, again, very complex. It isn't just that. We have situational things happening. We have empty nesting. We have relationships and jobs changing. So there's a lot of stuff that can underpin that time of your life, which will play a big part. But hormonally, we know that, you're not going to be so good at making serotonin and all those sort of things. So it's, again, I've used this phrase before, but it's really important. It's just these windows of vulnerability for anxiety and depression are really rife in those times.
And there's a lot more conversation about HRT. What are your thoughts on HRT and how does it actually work on things like mood, anxiety and leveling out those hormones?
If it suits you, get the HRT. I mean, it's amazing. Like what a bonus we can have for the body was if we are really depleted in a hormone, we can replace that hormone. So what happens when those hormones deplete? The receptors where sort of those hormones would essentially kind of dock into and deliver their message in the target cell. Those we have, particularly with estrogen, receptors over the entire body. And so that's why it feels so systemic and over the whole body when estrogen starts to decline. If we can then give the body a helping hand and replace those hormones, the body is just going to sort of function more optimally to a point. It doesn't suit everybody. And if it doesn't, there's lots of things we can do with diet and lifestyle. But as I say, I'm the biggest fan of integrating medicine. There are some incredible doctors and menopause doctors, but it's about getting the right support and individual support. It's not, playing the easy card by getting HRT. I think if you're able to do it, like, investigate it sooner rather than later, because why suffer if there's something that's going to improve your quality of life and then improve your mood, potentially improve your sex drive, which is going to boost your relationship, which is going to make you feel better. If you're having more sex, you've got more oxytocin, and that makes you feel fab. More oxytocin is like kryptonite to cortisol, and cortisol can come down. So it can massively play a big role in supporting mental health, so much so that some antidepressants can be used in sort of place of it. I'm not a pharmacologist or a doctor, but when you go to a specialist, that can play a role too as an option in those years.
So if you zoom out and look at the whole picture, so hormones, stress, mindset, lifestyle, what would you most want women to understand about protecting both their hormonal health and their mental well-being long term?
Not to overcomplicate it, not to put it on a pedestal, and realise that there's no powder, there's no one workout, there's no one diet that's just going to fix everything. And even the idea of like hormone balance is bonkers, because that doesn't really exist. We have the 24-hour cycles of cortisol, melatonin, the monthly cycles, and then the bigger hormonal shifts. Like, it is such an intricate, agile, living, breathing, shifting thing. And so I think it's the understanding of reading the room. Where are you in your lifespan? What could I do to help that particular lifespan at this point of time? And start small. If you're really suffering, seek help. Speak to a medical professional, speak to a healthcare professional like myself. But small changes make such a big difference. Even just shifting that morning routine and that breakfast, eating in the morning and realizing that food isn't the enemy. It's actually the very thing that could get you to your success story. So for anyone who is younger watching this, it's like there's never too early to start looking after your hormonal health, ever. But little things really do add up. So I think don't overcomplicate it. And there's always going to be like a gizmo, a gadget, the next trend. They come and go, but we know from the research and the sort of long-standing science, it's these core pillars: balancing your blood sugar, looking after your nervous system and reminding it that it's safe, working on your sleep, working on your muscle mass, working on also positive outlets. It's not only just about the food we eat, but there's, products, pesticides, and people can all impact your hormonal health. People can be a nightmare, and these are the things I call like energy vampires. Setting boundaries, it's okay to do that, and it's something I think when you're younger is really hard to do. I think we get, be the, say yes, be the quiet girl, or, just be sort of like, say yes to everything and put other people's feelings first. But actually, there's nothing wrong with setting boundaries when you need to protect yourself. And I think we have never been more available on your phones or WhatsApp. Like, it's wild. And if you don't instantly blue tick or message someone back, it can just ricochet in terms of feelings and that. And it's just too much. You need to set boundaries. And I think as you get older, it gets easier to say no, or I'm busy, or I'm just having some time off on my phone at the moment, wherever it may be. It's like setting the boundary blueprint of what's going to protect you, because protecting your peace is really important. And people are just as influential on your hormonal health as products and pesticides and stuff like that, honestly.
So true. Energy and
protect the energy.
Yeah. Very true. Hannah, you're an absolute star, and everything I know about hormones is just such a brilliant book, and I encourage everyone to get a copy who's interested in this subject, because it's a really, really brilliant, thorough read. So thank you.
My absolute pleasure.